Hello and welcome to Movie Recap. Today I am going to recap an action, thriller movie titled Rage. Here was a man in the room. He sat in silence, but his eyes looked intently at the door. Moments later, someone slowly opened the door, and the gun was pointed at him. Paul picked up his daughter at school. His daughter is Caitlin. She was happy when she saw her father waiting for her. Then, Paul noticed a drawing on his daughter's hand. Caitlin firmly explained that the drawing was made of henna. The reason for the drawing, she added, was because she was studying Indian culture. Paul thought that the drawing could not be erased, but Caitlin clarified that the drawing could be smudged. On the way home, Paul gave Caitlin a book of practice questions for the student admissions examination so that she could start preparing for it. But Caitlin reminded her father that the exam was still next year. In addition, Paul asked about the progress of Caitlin's paper. He hoped it would be published soon. Delighted, Caitlin replied that her paper was almost finished. After dropping Caitlin off, Paul went to meet his friends at the bar. They talked about preparations for Caitlin's 16th birthday celebration, which Paul would celebrate at the bar next Saturday. Paul made sure that his daughter's birthday would be free of alcohol and drugs. They also talked about when they were younger and how many problems they had caused. Then Paul went back to work. He attended a press conference with the town mayor. One of the reporters asked Paul what the profits from the project would be used for. Paul said that the profits from the project would be used for education and health. In the evening, Paul and Vanessa got ready to attend Thompson and Dean White's dinner. Paul asked who Thompson was. Thompson works for the governor, and it looks like he is going to be a provincial police officer, Vanessa said. So it was a good opportunity to get to know them, she added. Before Paul went out to dinner, he made sure that Caitlin stayed at home with her friends. He also reminded her that Caitlin had a lot of homework and needed to stay focused on school. Paul also talked to Mike, Caitlin's friend. Paul asked if it was true that he was already working and how it felt to work. Then Paul asked Mike for help lifting boxes in the kitchen. While in the kitchen, Paul firmly asked if Mike dated Caitlin, whether he took drugs or weeds. At first, Mike was pessimistic about Paul. He was afraid that Paul would not allow him to like his daughter. But it turned out that Paul supported Mike to get close to Caitlin. After a while, Vanessa came over to Caitlin. She advised Caitlin to behave well. When Paul and Vanessa left during the dinner, Paul felt uneasy as it was already midnight. He was worried about his daughter, who was at home. However, to hide his worries, he continued to talk with his associates. After a while, a police detective, Peter, walked up to Paul. The police detective said something about Caitlin. They rushed back to Paul's house. There were many police and ambulances there, and also Mike and Evan. Peter explained that Caitlin, Ian, and Mike were together when the incident happened. They tried to fight back, but the three criminals successfully kidnapped Caitlin. Peter tried to ask Paul if he had a problem with someone so that the person kidnapped Caitlin. Paul was a little annoyed by the question. He was sure he didn't have any problems at all. But the detective told Paul to keep in mind that this could be related to people in Paul's past, like Francis. Paul denied it. Meanwhile, Vanessa supported whatever Paul would do to find Caitlin. Vanessa was heartbroken over Caitlin's disappearance. The next morning, Vanessa saw the news about Caitlin's missing that was broadcast on TV. Meanwhile, Paul was ready to go looking for Caitlin. Then Paul left, followed by several policemen on duty. He visited Mike's house. Paul felt disappointed with him because he could not protect Caitlin. Paul asked if Mike remembered anything about the criminal, but unfortunately, he didn't remember anything. Then Paul called his friends. He rushed off to ask his friends for help. He gave them money to reward them for helping him, but his friend refused because he thought that Paul was their family. Danny and Kane went to Oliver. They were looking for information about Caitlin, but Oliver didn't say anything. The next day, they went to see Paul. They said that they had not found any information about Caitlin. One day, a man was jogging near the river. When he stopped, he saw a body floating in the river. Soon, a policeman who was with Paul received a call. He told him that Caitlin's body had been found. Hearing the news, Paul felt sad and shocked. Paul saw Caitlin's body in the hospital. He cried and felt sorry. He took Caitlin's hand and kissed her forehead on the day of Caitlin's funeral. Paul's old friends and colleagues were there. One of Paul's old friends, named Francis, expressed his sadness at the death of Paul's daughter. Afterward, he wanted to talk to Paul. Paul walked over and pushed him, as he was in a wheelchair. They talked about their past as criminals. Francis felt that Paul's life was very comfortable with everything: a job, a house, a business, and a beautiful wife. He also thought that Paul must have wanted to do something about the loss of his daughter, Caitlin. Hearing that, Paul was a little skeptical of Francis. He thought there was an implicit meaning behind the words. Francis suggested that Paul report the case of his son's death to the police, but Paul ignored Francis's advice. Meanwhile, Francis was very adamant about his opinion. He also reminded Paul that he was the one who had helped him get out of his dirty business clean. Now, Francis wanted Paul to repay his kindness by letting Caitlin go and handing over the case to the police. Their conversation ended with Paul leaving Francis. After Caitlin's funeral, Paul, Vanessa, Danny, and Kane went to Paul's house. Paul sent Vanessa away, leaving them talking in the kitchen. Paul asked them for advice. Kane advised Paul not to do anything because Francis was keeping an eye on and threatening Paul. But Paul still wanted to investigate Caitlin's death. They then recalled past incidents that they had solved properly without leaving a trace. At the police station, two policemen were discussing Paul and his past. They argued how someone with a dark past could become a legitimate businessman without any mistakes. The young policeman showed a data point that showed the weapon used by the criminal who kidnapped Caitlin was an old pistol from the Soviet Union, a Tokarev. This was reminiscent of the Chernow family murders. The first incident was in 1983, and the other two in 1988. This meant that the killer had not committed any murders for a long time, and he was still here. The next morning, Paul sat in the dining room. He looked at the paper Caitlin had made, and then he gave it to Caitlin's class teacher at school. Paul also took Caitlin's belongings from her locker. Then he sat down, looking at the things. In the field near where he stopped, he saw a mother and son playing ball. This made Paul think of his wife and Caitlin. Paul's two friends suspected that Caitlin's killer was Chernov. They went to Paul's house and tried to tell him that the murderer might be a Russian mafia hitman using a Tokarev TT-33 pistol. In the afternoon, they met Danny, and they left to look for the whereabouts of Caitlin's killer. They entered a gambling establishment, and Paul and his friends fought against the people inside. They managed to defeat the people. The next day, Paul told Vanessa to pack her bags and leave his house. They argued. Vanessa didn't want to leave their house, while Paul wanted Vanessa to be in a safe place. Later, Paul, Danny, and Kane searched for information elsewhere. Paul felt that he needed the help of a Russian gangster to find out Caitlin's murderer. Therefore, they met the person in a bar. After seeing the tattoos on the man's neck, Paul remembered an incident 19 years ago when he stole money. It turned out that the man knew who Paul was. The man suddenly ran from Paul, but Paul caught him. Paul had guessed that the man knew Paul was the one who stole Chow's money from him 19 years ago. Paul didn't care what he said, he just continued to ask questions about who killed Caitlin. But the man died of a gunshot wound to the stomach from being shot by Danny while running away from the bar. Seeing that he was very frustrated and sad, Paul returned home, and then went to the bar to see the detective. The detective said that Paul's actions would not be able to bring his daughter back to the world. The detective told him that his son had been hit by a car. He almost shot the person who hit his son, but undid his intention because his son returned to health. Hearing the story, Paul was annoyed. He said that the difference between Caitlin's case and the detective's son was that Caitlin died while the detective's son was still alive. After leaving the bar, Paul, Danny, and Kane went to a house suspected of being the base of Caitlin's assassin. They were determined to find the mastermind behind the murder of Paul's daughter. Soon, they were able to defeat Chernov's men. The next morning, the police arrived at the house that had been messed up. It turned out that the house was a drug operation led by Chernov. The police were shocked at the state of the house. The detective felt defeated by someone who was able to destroy Chernov's operation. After getting the news that Chernov's drug base was destroyed by Paul, Chernov's men reported the incident. Of course, Chernov was upset and disgusted with the man who killed people without expressing his wishes. Chernov's men went immediately to CS Bar. It didn't take long before they were able to knock Kane out and take him away. Hearing that, Paul was angry. He ran after Chernov's 4 men, speeding up, violating traffic laws, and crashing into cars several times. Paul was also chased by the police. Eventually, the police were able to stop Paul. Paul was very angry and upset because he lost Chernov's men who had taken Kane. But soon, the detective let Paul go, allowing Paul to do what he wanted. Paul arrived at Chernov's base. He was hanged and questioned about why he killed Chernov's men. Kane said that Chernov was Caitlin's killer. Hearing that, Chernov was angry and killed Kane. After Paul was released by the detective, he went to Danny's home base. They argued and fought. Danny felt he was loyal to their friendship, but Paul thought that Danny was the one who betrayed him by reporting the 19-year-old incident to Francis, which was eventually heard by Chernov. But Danny denied the accusation. In the end, Paul accidentally stabbed Danny in the stomach, which killed him. Chernov decided to meet with Francis. After the fight, Chernov took down Kane's body to prove that he wasn't playing around with all of this. He explained that Kane was one of the people who killed Chernov's brother, and Paul's actions had caused Chernov and Francis to become enemies. Chernov wanted Francis to do something for him, but he firmly refused to accept the rule of people like Chernov. Instantly, Chernov became angry, and they shot at each other. Unfortunately, Francis died on the spot. After Danny died, Paul decided to go home. On his way, he recalled everything about his daughter's death, the events of 19 years ago, and he thought of Danny and Kane. When he arrived home, he opened the gun case that was used 19 years ago when he and his best friend stole the money. As he opened the box, Paul cried and felt guilty for what had happened to his best friend. Later that evening, Ian and Mike met in front of a building. After Ian saw Mike, Evan left him, but Mike didn't know what Evan meant. However, it turned out that Evan invited Mike so that Paul could meet him. When Paul arrived, Mike was terrified. He finally admitted that Caitlin's death was his fault. He told everything that actually happened when he was playing with Paul's gun. He didn't know that it contained bullets, and they were drunk at the time. He had his back to Caitlin, and when he turned around, he accidentally shot her in the head. Evan and Mike were scared and confused, so they took Caitlin to the woods and made it seem as if it was a robber or mafia attacking them. At home, Paul was shocked and regretful when he heard Mike's unexpected explanation. At first, Paul wanted to kill Mike, but he felt weak and decided against it. Paul decided to go to Caitlin's room, where he sat on her bed. He called Vanessa and explained that the situation was safe. He told her about his dark past and apologized for disappointing Vanessa. Sadly, Paul ended the call as he prepared himself to end his life by stabbing himself with a knife. Shortly afterward, 3 criminals approached Paul, who was in Caitlin's room. Wordlessly, the criminals gunned down the dying Paul. Subscribe for more videos like this, turn on the notification, and leave a like to help the channel out. Thanks for watching.